Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the May 14 work session of the Ann Arbor City Council, ensuring an inclusive community, equity, and affordable housing. Mr. Delacourt.
First of all, thank you, Mayor and Council, for giving us this opportunity to work with you tonight. Here tonight we have Jennifer Hall from the City's Housing Commission and Teresa Gelati from the Washtenaw County Office of Community and Economic Development. And they're here tonight to give you a detailed presentation on the status of affordable housing in the city of Ann Arbor and the Washtenaw County. And I'm going to turn it over to them now to get started. So thank you.
Thank you, Mayor and City Council. Before we get started, I would actually like to acknowledge some folks in the community that do affordable housing that are here with us tonight but won't be part of the discussion. We have people from the Housing and Human Services Advisory Board, if you could raise your hand. We have folks from Avalon Housing. We have someone here from Habitat for Humanity. And the Ann Arbor Housing Commission's board as well. And there might be some service providers here, so I apologize if I missed anyone. And I also apologize in advance. It's a very dense presentation. We have a lot of information, some of which we might just skip over, but it's there for you to peruse or to ask questions about, and others we're going to go into in a lot more depth. What we're going to talk about first, we're going to show a short video. What we want to do is have a common language and a common understanding of some of the ways that governmental policies impact affordable housing. And we're going to start out with a video it's called The House We Live In, and it's part of a three-part presentation called Race, the Power of Illusion. It's going to be about 15 minutes. Then we're going to talk about some of the history and impacts of affordable housing and racial equity in the city of Ann Arbor and Washtenaw County. Then we're going to kind of do a affordable housing development 101 and really try to help people understand how development happens, what it costs. We're going to take time for questions as we go. We don't have to wait till the very end. And then we're going to have a set of solutions and actions, and we hope to end the evening with 3 to 5 sort of consensus ideas or policies to move forward more significantly on including affordable housing into the future. And we will start with our video. Thank you.
They tried building Quonset huts, and they turned it to slums. All the Quonset huts just disintegrated. There were 2 families sharing a hut. One family at one end, one family at the other, and before you know it, they were awful.
FHA came to the rescue by ensuring long-term, low monthly payment mortgage loans.
Veterans needed homes for families. They turned to a revolutionary New Deal housing program. It would racialize housing, wealth, and opportunity for decades in ways few could have imagined.
In the 1930s, the federal government created the Federal Housing Administration, whose job it was to provide loans, or the backing for loans, to average Americans so they could purchase a home.
Due to the stimulation of the National Housing Act, from every section of the country come reports of vastly...
In order to purchase a house in America prior to 1930s, you had to pay 50% of the sales price up front. The new terms of purchasing a home was that you put 10% or 20% down, and the bank financed 80% of it, not over 5 years, but over 30 years at relatively low rates. This opened up the opportunities for Americans to own homes like ever before. The average person could own that home.
If these terms sound familiar, they should, because this is essentially the same financing scheme that allows most Americans to own their homes today. Federal programs and banks sank millions into the home construction industry. Their message to veterans: you can afford a new home. Buy a new home now. On the outskirts of Baltimore, Memphis, Chicago, Los Angeles, Denver, and other cities, brand new communities sprang up. One of the most famous was a Long Island potato field, transformed into 17,000 new homes. It was called Levittown. Tax dollars helped make the single-family home a mass-produced consumer item. The American dream had a new name: suburbia.
You have to remember the people who came here in 1947, 1948 were young ex-GIs whose uppermost concern was taking advantage of GI Bill and making things better for themselves.
Before moving to Levittown, Herb Callisman and his wife Doris lived in a cramped attic apartment in New York City.
And when we began to look for an apartment, we found that the apartments were $100, $125, $150 a month. I know that's unbelievable today, but it was too expensive for us. And out here in Levittown, the mortgage payments was $65 a month.
Your kitchen dazzles every eye. A brand new sink, a built-in oven, a new refrigerator, and
If you were buying a living home in 1947, 48, 49, 50, and 51, you would get, this would be your kitchen. You would get a GE stove, GE refrigerator, and a Bendix wash machine. It would be part of the real estate.
We came to Levittown and we found the model house, and we walked in and we looked around, and of course in the eyes of a young man who was raised in the ghetto, so to speak, it was an interesting experience, interesting lifestyle, seeing all the new modern conveniences, very fascinating.
Eugene Burnett came home with almost 1 million other black GIs. They had fought for the country in segregated ranks. They returned hoping for equality and the American dream. For many, that dream was a new home for little money down and some of the easiest credit terms in history.
I went up to the salesman. We're interested in your home, we're interested in buying one, and what is the procedure? Is there an application to be filled out? So forth. So he looked at me, looked around, and he said to me, he says, listen, it's not me, but the owners of this development have not as yet decided to sell these homes to Negroes.
It was as though it wasn't real. You can't imagine. But for someone to come out and actually tell you that they can't sell to you, you know, I was really on a, oh man, look at this house. Can you imagine having this? And then for them to tell me because of the color of my skin, I can't be a part of it.
The FHA underwriters warned that the presence of even 1 or 2 non-white families could undermine real estate values in the new suburbs. These government guidelines were widely adopted by private industry. Race had long played a role in local real estate practices. Starting in the 1930s, government officials institutionalized the national appraisal system, where race was as much a factor in real estate assessment as the condition of the property. Using this scheme, Federal investigators evaluated 239 cities across the country for financial risk.
So that those communities that were all white, suburban, and far away from minority areas, they received the highest rating, and that was the color green. Those communities that were all minority or in the process of changing, they got the lowest rating, and the color red. They were redlined. As a consequence, most of the mortgages went to suburbanizing America, and it suburbanized it racially.
The racial logic adopts the principle that an integrated neighborhood is a bad risk, is a financial risk, that an integrated neighborhood is likely to be an unstable neighborhood, unstable socially, but therefore also unstable economically.
When the white residents of 8 Mile Road in Detroit were told they were too close to a black neighborhood to qualify for a positive FHA rating, they built this 6-foot wall between themselves and their black neighbors. Once the wall went up, mortgages on the white properties were approved. Between 1934 and 1962, the federal government underwrote $120 billion in new housing. Less than 2% went to non-whites.
I can understand an individual, depending on his environment or his family or whatever, being racist, but for your country to sanction it, give him tools to do that, there's something definitely wrong there.
I think we had the golden chance after World War II, and we flubbed it, because here we had a GI Bill that was that was available to everybody, but in a way they didn't make it available to everybody, and that was a golden opportunity in this country, and we missed it. We really missed it.
You can always tell, can't you? A town with good real estate people is a more substantial community because more people own their own homes. That's right.
And now it's hard to believe that the federal government nationalized and introduced redlining. In a funny way, it wasn't just giving something to whites, it was constructing whiteness. Whiteness meant, as in the past, whites had meant being a citizen and being a Christian. It now meant living in the suburbs.
Only 50 years before, European ethnics were believed to be distinct races. Now, in these new segregated neighborhoods, they blended together as white Americans.
We did have different religious groups. We were mixed up there, but we were an all-white community, and I think it's an unrealistic world. I think there's something sterile about everyone being on the same economic level and everyone being the same color.
It certainly doesn't promote a feeling of a wider world, wider, not whiter, to live in a place where there are only people that look like you.
Cartoonist Bill Griffith remembers moving from Brooklyn to Levittown as a kid.
It's an untenable artificial world. You're creating a weird utopia in a way. A utopia of middle-class white people who were trying to deny that they were living in a multi-racial world. And how long can you keep that up? You can't keep that up forever. Whether there were going to be black people in Levittown is just, it would be almost the equivalent of saying, are there going to be Martians in Levittown?
The basic idea of whiteness is who's included, who's part of the family, and it has material consequences. Blacks weren't completely left out of the housing market. The housing market, they were exposed to was largely public housing. And public housing, first of all, was built almost exclusively, with a few exceptions, in the central city. And after World War II, we started building these larger and larger public housing projects, which are called vertical ghettos. All of a sudden, you're concentrating large numbers of poor people of color in one place.
Another federal program, urban renewal, was supposed to make cities more livable. 90% of all housing destroyed by urban renewal was not replaced. 2/3 of those displaced were Black or Latino.
Fair housing for all human beings who live in this country is now a part of the American way of life.
In 1968, President Johnson signed the Fair Housing Act. For the first time, racial language was removed from federal housing policy. Non-white families began moving into traditionally white communities in numbers.
We lived in an apartment, a two-family house in Queens, and when we came here, it was the first time we bought a house, and I was looking for everything in the storybooks.
The Frisbees moved from Queens to suburban Roosevelt, only a few miles from Levittown. Like the Frisbees, many non-white families would discover the economic value of race in the real estate market. They watched as their homes and neighborhoods in suburbia declined precisely because they had moved into them.
When I moved into a neighborhood, I thought it would stay intact the way it was. On the street that I moved on when I moved there, it was predominantly white. Within 2 years, it was predominantly Black.
It was called blockbusting. Real estate agents preyed on the racial fears of white homeowners to get them to sell their homes quickly for less than market value. The homes were resold to non-whites at inflated prices.
Well, they would say, you know, we're having Black people move in. Now, I will give you cash if you want to sell me your house. Do you want to stay with Black people next door to you? And that's the way it went on. And as Bunny said, a lot of the people just said, yes, I'll take the money and run. And that's the start of the white people leaving.
So some of the practices in the video would be considered explicitly racist policies that were implemented by primarily the federal government, but similar things happened locally and state governments. It was nationwide. This covenant is an example of one in Washtenaw County. I think it's in the city of Ann Arbor. Obviously, it's not enforced, but they're still out there if you ever want to look up deeds. There were many tools that were used over time that really limited the housing options of people of color, despite having fair housing laws, despite having civil rights laws. And now it's kind of changed from more explicit policies, often to unintentional ones, or they might be intentional, but we're not aware of it, but the impact is disparate on people of color. This slide really is to just illustrate a couple things. Most people think that the biggest source of housing for affordable housing, low-income housing, is from HUD. And it used to be that way. It used to be that HUD was the primary source of funding. They provide funding for public housing, project-based Section 8, Section 8 vouchers, et cetera. back in the 60s, the HUD budget was $80 billion. And this year, not including inflation, it was $42.7 billion. And so there's been a serious decline in housing for HUD housing. And really most of that budget right now is to maintain what was already there. So it's helping to maintain public housing, for example, the operations. It's not increasing, the number of housing units. Actually, the very biggest program, the very biggest federal housing program is the mortgage interest deduction. So I own my house. Probably many of us here own our houses. I'm very happy to write off my mortgage interest on my taxes. The amount that was written off in 2017, and primarily homeowners are primarily white people, not people of color, was $146 billion. So the amount that was written off for those of us who own our homes was 3 times or more higher than the amount of funding in the HUD program. I think that's really important for us to understand because I wasn't aware of that till the last couple of years, and I've been doing this for 25 years. So I think it's important to keep in mind some of the programs that help people who are homeowners. The actual biggest, newest source for new affordable housing is actually the low-income housing tax credit. I'm not going to go into depth on it other than to say the way that works is I would have to compete as the Housing Commission or Avalon for these tax credits. If we're awarded, there's about $9 billion a year allocated for tax credits. We would have to sell them to an investor like a bank or an insurance company. The investor or bank, they give us cash for our tax credits so that they can write those tax credits off on their taxes. And so rather than having money dedicated to a housing program, we now have a program that it's at the whims of the marketplace. When the federal tax rate was reduced from 35% to 22% for places that are usually our investors like banks, the tax credit market fell precipitously. It fell about 10 cents on the dollar. Our current project that we're working on, 1 penny offered for the size of the project we have is equal to $140,000 cash. And so that's $1.4 million less funding we have for a project because of a federal policy that may or may not have unintended consequences of impacting the housing market.
So kind of going back to those explicitly racial policies, to FHA, we take a look at census maps from 1960. This is the African American population in Ann Arbor. You can see that the largest percentages were concentrated in Tarrytown and what's down in the Slaughter Hill areas, as well as the south side of Ypsi, and then a portion over by Willow Run, which was the area where African American Willow Run workers were allowed to live. So it's very specific on where you could and couldn't live based on these covenant deeds and other practices in place that really limited those choices. Since then, though, of course, you want to see now where's the African American population. So this is the concentration now. In Ann Arbor, you see that it's sort of thinned out, and what you're seeing is a concentration on the east side, basically east of 23. This is sort of kind of playing out in different ways based on some of those initial sort of structurally racist practices, but now we've got market pressures that are sort of exacerbating it. In 2015, the Martin Prosperity Institute did a study nationally of the most segregated cities in the country, and Ann Arbor was the 8th most segregated, which is, it's amazing to see us compared nationally and falling out that way. It's sort of still problematic how we're seeing this play out, and it's not just economic, it's also coming along racial lines. This is something we talked about a lot with the 2015 Housing Affordability and Economic Equity Analysis, and how those pressures, whether it's U of M adding students but not student housing, how Ann Arbor is adding jobs, which is amazing, and attracting lots of people to the community. So there's good and bad, right? There's great things happening, but it is creating tension and stress across the region and sort of this economic and racial segregation as a result. I gotta flip my page. Thank you. One of the things that we want to make sure is that we're able to address those needs. Related to that, another layer on top of it is that where we have our committed affordable housing units, these are units that don't fluctuate the markets. They're set based on incomes of residents and also limits to rent that can be paid. Almost 50%, yes, of all the committed affordable units are in the city of Ypsilanti and Ypsilanti Township, where that's only about 20% of the county's population. So we're seeing that there's still the majority of those units on the east side. We know we need more in the city of Ann Arbor, Pittsfield, Scioto, and other places.
Can I just add also, with our Section 8 voucher program, although we're the Ann Arbor Housing Commission, and so you would think our vouchers would be used in the city of Ann Arbor, only about 35% are used in the city of Ann Arbor just because of the market pressures, the high competition, the prices are too high, landlords don't accept vouchers. So 2/3 of our vouchers approximately are used in Ypsi City, Ypsi Township as well.
And here's a map of that from a few years ago that shows you where public assistance also, so that's vouchers and other public assistance, and where we're seeing that again, majority of those are east of 22. So from that 2015 housing affordability study, there were recommendations, right? So goals, the city of Ann Arbor, Pittsfield, Ann Arbor DDA, Washtenaw County, Ypsi Township, city of Ypsi, all adopted the study with those goals. For Ann Arbor, we were looking to add 140 units, affordable units for households up to 60% of the area median income each year for 20 years. We've made a little bit of progress. In 2015, the first year, we added 2 units. That was an Avalon project. In 2016, we added 16. In 2017, we added 30. Those were both West Arbor, different phases that were filled in. In 2018, we're sort of slotted for looking like 6 new units, the Avalon Scott Street project. So we're not quite getting where we need to be to reach those goals. And so as we go along, some of the recommendations we're going to make are trying to accelerate us getting closer and closer to reaching those goals. So the question we often talk about, right? How are we talking about affordable housing? So generally, affordability, if you're talking about affordability for housing, you should be spending more than 30% of your gross annual income on housing. That's rent, that's utilities. If you're a homeowner, that's mortgages and taxes. And you're basically trying to make sure that you're not spending too much or burdening your general income so that you don't have the ability to buy clothes or have medical appointments or go to school or any of the other needs that you would have for you or your household.
I'd like to add that it's an aspirational goal. We're going to talk later about how you set rents, how that's impacted by what your income is. It's a goal. It's not a law to pay 30% of your income on your housing cost. In fact, that was and is the current HUD definition. But President Trump has made a recommendation that be changed to 35% of your income. 15, 20 years ago, it used to be 25% of your income on affordable on housing costs. So it's a changing target.
Absolutely. And another way to look at it is to combine both housing and transportation costs. Because as we were talking about, a lot of people are getting pushed out of the city of Ann Arbor who might want to be living here. Maybe they're working here. We know that there's almost 90,000 people that work in Ann Arbor but live outside of the city limits. So that's a lot of people that could very well want to live here. But if you're adding your housing and transportation costs, that aspirational goal is to not exceed 45% of your gross income. But as we have more people commuting, then we're dealing with more things like congestion. Obviously, we're dealing with pollution and other concerns as well. And then as we looked earlier about where the public assistance was in low-income households, if we're pushing people further and further out and their incomes are lower, then it's harder for them to reach job centers, services, education. So it becomes more of a burden as well.
And it also becomes a burden on the city of Ann Arbor's infrastructure, on our roads, when you have many, many people commuting, over 50,000 households commute into Ann Arbor for work that are not paying taxes here. And we're going to stop right here and see if there's any questions before we move to the next section. All right. Are you sure? Okay.
Oh, sorry. Please.
Okay. So one thing I think it's very important for us to all have a common understanding is when we say affordable housing, what are we talking about? For those of us in the business, it's really about what income target. What is the area median income target? What is the area median income? What does that even mean? In the state of Michigan, the area median income is $67,300. In Washtenaw County, Ann Arbor doesn't have its own area median income. In Washtenaw County, the area median income for all family sizes, families can be related or unrelated, but you're living in the same household, is $92,900. So half of households are below that, half are above that. And if you think about how many students are in Ann Arbor, when they report to the Census Bureau what their income is, or they report their income taxes, there's a very large number that are in, make $5,000 or $4,000. So if you remove the students out of that calculation, I'm sure it would be over $100,000 as the median income for non-students. And when you look at this chart, what you need to understand is when a chart is created like this, it isn't reflecting the real household sizes and the real incomes in every one of those little boxes. It's a formula. So if you take a circle and circle 92,900, which I forgot to do in red, which is a 4-person household at 100% of median income, what happens is HUD just takes that number, plops it into a 4-person household at a median income, and everything else on this chart is a formula. So a 3-person household is 90% of that at median income. A 2-person is 80% of that at median income, et cetera. And if you work your way up the chart, so if you're at the 50% of median income, you can see that a 4-person household is half the size, half the income of the 92.9. It's a formula. It doesn't mean that that is the income ranges for those household sizes, but you have to have a start. In red, you can see when we do housing programs, just to give you an idea of which types of programs target which income, under 30% AMI, if you target that, it doesn't mean that you're talking about households that don't work. We have many, many households that make less than 19.5 that are single people, or less than 22 or 22.3 for a 2-person household. But if you are targeting, if you have funding for homeless targeted or special needs targeted, or you have supportive housing, that's the cap. That's the cap of the income. Anybody below that qualifies. That's just the cap. If you move up or down on that chart to 50% of AMI, housing choice vouchers, that's the cap. Right now, the DDA housing funds, that's the cap as well. At 60% AMI, that is where the city pilot ordinance is capped at, which is payment in lieu of taxes. You have to be a special kind of housing to be able to get a pilot rather than paying full taxes. And that is also the cap for the Affordable Housing Fund, the city's Affordable Housing Fund. At 80% AMI, the low-income housing tax credit program that I mentioned earlier, which is the biggest source of new housing, the way our city zoning code's written, public housing, et cetera, that's the cap. And so when you look at the median income, and when we talk going forward about what income target we want to think about that needs a public subsidy to make that kind of housing happen in the marketplace, it's not really at the median income, it's not 120% of median, it's at those lower income targets. And so this is how you translate, if 30% of your income is determining how much the maximum rent is, that's your chart. That's your go-to chart where your rents cannot exceed that amount. It doesn't mean you can't pay more than that if your income fits that. If you have, for example, if you have a 100% unit at 1626, and your income means 30% of your income, you only can pay $1,000, but you qualify for that unit based on your income, you can still have to pay $1,626. You're just going to pay more than 30% of your income. That's why I say it's an aspiration of something you're trying to make as a goal, but it doesn't mean you'll never pay more than 30% of your income on rent, even if you have a rent-restricted household or rent-restricted unit. Any questions on that? There's a attachment, if anybody wants to look in detail, there's a very detailed discussion of how you determine rent and income that was attached to this presentation.
So we wanted to give you an idea of kind of what kind of working groups or people with certain types of jobs would fall in these income ranges. So we pulled this from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, their most recent data for this from May of 2017. And that's for the city of Ann Arbor, as well as city of Ann Arbor, based on some of your starting salaries for positions working for the city. And we wanted to show you kind of a look of where they would fall. So if we're talking about 30% of the area median income are getting 19,500, you're looking at cashiers, cooks, waitstaff, childcare workers. Lots of restaurant workers and service jobs are going to fall into those very low income bands. In the middle, at the 50% or 32,500, school bus drivers, phlebotomists, community health workers, office clerks, pharmacy techs, interior designers fall generally in that group. And then we polled some city jobs, and they're falling closer to the 80% of the AMI at 50,300. The bailiff, the HR coordinator, city water technicians, police officers. These are starting salaries within those positions, just as a note. And Arbor Housing Commission asked us that as well.
There's a study done by Fulton and Grimes every year to look at the fastest growing jobs by local economy. And of the 20 fastest growing jobs in the Ann Arbor area, 9 were jobs that paid under 60% AMI, and 4 were under 30% AMI. So there's a huge growth in that market.
And those 4 that are under about 20,000 are all restaurant jobs and fitness staff.
And healthcare workers.
Yes. That way.
So there's the term, we say affordable, but it's really synonymous with a lot of other terms. It can be synonymous with low income. It can be synonymous with committed units. It can be synonymous with workforce. The only term on here that really has a specified terminology is permanent supportive housing is specifically for 30% AMI or less, homeless and special needs households that have access to services. Senior housing can fluctuate, but generally it's 55 plus, but some places it's higher. And so if you want to talk about affordable or workforce, there's no like national definition. They're kind of interchangeable. I'm going to give a little bit of history because we have a lot to get through. In your packages attached to the presentation, there was a map of all the committed affordable units in the city of Ann Arbor as of 2012, so you can see sort of the distribution of where those are within the city. Back in 1964, City Council passed an ordinance deciding that they wanted to have a Ann Arbor Housing Commission. So it was created by city ordinance. The ordinance actually says that the council has to acquire property on our behalf. So we go out and get the funding from HUD or wherever we get it from, and then council has to actually do the purchase, and you can deed it over, which has been happening with a lot of our public housing. The Section 8 program started in the 1970s. The idea of Section 8 was to, instead of having concentrated sites of a lot of low-income people, which aren't really happening in Ann Arbor so much as other communities, the idea is to provide a voucher that people can take out into the private sector, and hopefully they can be more dispersed in the community. But if you cannot find housing that's within that rent that's in the voucher, you will not be able to find housing in Ann Arbor. Most of the low-income housing that's fixed, built in Ann Arbor right now are the co-ops. The Housing and Human Service Advisory Board was actually created. It had a different name and several boards many iterations ago in the early 1980s based on really some activist council members. Jean Carlberg is one of those that's here right now. Larry Davis, Toby Hannah Davies. When they were on council, they thought affordable housing was important enough that they actually, I think, went to Chicago and went to some training, came back with some ideas. The Housing Board, HHSAB, is in the manifest of what we have today out of that, as well as the Housing Fund. The Ann Arbor Housing Fund used to be called Ann Arbor Housing Trust Fund. The idea of that trust fund was to have funding come from private developers, either as contributions, either voluntary or with Jean twisting their arm, or through the zoning ordinance, primarily the planned unit development ordinance. Not very much money has gotten into that fund through those processes. The most significant has come from the sale of city-owned property. There used to be a council ordinance requiring all proceeds to go into the fund, and it switched to 50%, and it's been at 10%. Like, it's been all over the map, but it's really up to council on how you want to distribute sale of city-owned property. I think I'll skip to the next one. I'm going to do a little bit of specific history so we can take it from the federal level to decisions that are made locally and how it impacts the housing market. This is actually the original Y. So we've been talking about the Y that was before the Y that's before that Y. This is the first Y. There actually, I heard that there was a swimming pool on the basement floor that was filled in, and this is where the original Y was. And in the early, whenever, I don't know when the Y moved from here to the other side of 4th Avenue, but whenever that happened, this building was turned into single-room occupancy housing. Single-room occupancy housing is basically you have a room, but you have shared bathroom and kitchen. So it tends to be people on the lower income live there because it's an inexpensive place to live. In the 1980s as well, I don't know what year, the county actually purchased this building in order to put office staff there. So what happened to the people who were living there? They got displaced. Around that same time, there was, or a little bit earlier than that, there were 100 units added to the new Y as SROs as well. And then they got displaced, as we know, when that building went down. And so there are public decisions that are made that impacts the housing community, and maybe not intentionally, but it does happen. The other property I want to talk about, this is actually, if you're familiar with Avalon's properties, this is the very first house that became part of their portfolio. In the 1980s, there was a group called the Homeless Action Committee. Their slogan was "House People, Not Cars." That is how I got involved in housing, because I was participated with the Homeless Action Committee. And what their slogan was generated around was what we would call the Klein's lot. There is no Klein's anymore. It left Main Street. But on the corner of William and Ashley, there were 3 houses, and there was discussion on City Council to tear those houses down and build a 5- or 6-story parking structure. And so that kind of coalesced and brought some activists around housing together. We actually, I was one of the participants that actually squatted those houses, moved in, lived there with some homeless folks, had a lot of conversation with City Council. That led to the City Council and the DDA deciding not to build parking structure at that time. Doesn't mean it can't still be built. But at that time, and the DDA had a property kitty corner on the other side of William and Ashley, and they agreed to move the house. And when they moved the house, they did an RFP. The shelter was the winning bid, decided that that was not their game to do housing, and that spawned off Avalon creating itself. And now they have roughly 300 apartments in 28 to 30 locations scattered throughout the city now. And this is really an illustration to show what you can do when you're thoughtfully looking at your policies and you're really thinking about the impact on the housing. One thing I want to make clear, in having redeveloped our own properties these last few years and being very enmeshed in development, is that decisions you think you're going to make today can be very different than 2 or 3 years from now. The market's constantly changing. It's very site specific. What can work on one property isn't going to work maybe even on the property next door to it. It depends on zoning. It depends on how dense you can make it, setbacks. It depends on funding sources. And development is a very high-risk business to be in. You have to put out hundreds of thousands of dollars just to determine site feasibility before you even get to the point of coming to City Council for a site plan approval. And nothing is more fraught with politics than site plan approval. So I wanted to talk through what the perception in the community, some people in the community, is that there's a very large difference between developing market and affordable housing. There is, but maybe not in the way that you think. When it comes to housing costs, like what does it cost to build? If I build the same building on the same site as a for-profit market rate developer, you know, the same units, the same density, our construction costs, our development costs aren't really going to be that different. They're going to have a slightly higher cost on their finishes, so that part's going to be higher for the market rate. We're going to have higher cost on our financing, some of our attorney's fees, you know, things like that on the professional side. So when you put it all together, really the biggest difference is when you do affordable housing, you cannot increase the rents anytime you want based on the market. So you have a fixed rent, and you project, and you have limits on how much it can increase every year. Therefore, what you do in affordable housing is you capitalize the reserves, your operating, if you need them, operating reserves, your capital reserves up front as part of your development costs, and you also pay your developer up front as part of your development costs. When you're in the private sector, it's more about all the construction costs, the soft costs. You might have some fees that are paid to the actual developer, but most of it is on the rate of return on your investment as the project's going forward. So it's just structured a little bit differently, but the construction development costs really aren't that different. The biggest difference is how you finance the project. So you can see on the first one, that's the same building, market rate. I just looked at sort of market rate rents, and typically, not always, but a typical one would be about 30% is equity. So your developer, your investors, whoever they are, is cash. That's your cash investment. And the rest you borrow. You borrow from a bank. You got to pay it back. So you got to figure out how you can pay that money back. The second one is an example of if you did, the largest number of new affordable housing projects are actually built by affordable housing developers who are for-profit. That's their business, and not nonprofit. There's only about 35% that are built by nonprofits. But the second example is a typical tax credit where there's just really those same two sources, but they're flipped. So 70% comes as equity when you sell your tax credits, and then 30%-ish would be taking out a loan from a bank, and that covers your costs. The biggest difference between those projects and like the Housing Commission or Avalon is if we're targeting lower incomes and we have less rent revenue, we can't borrow as much. So we can still get 70% in equity, but we might only have 10 or 15% borrowed. The rest has to be grants. And so we leverage the heck out of the city's funds and bring in other dollars to make these projects work. Me again. And so if you look at the rents, and you can see the difference, and that's a rent revenue, like that's annual rent revenue. Clearly, the market rate is extremely high compared to the rent revenue from the tax credit, and even less revenue because we hit lower income targets with a nonprofit. But you can see that the cost of operations is dark purple on the bottom. On the market side, it's actually going to be a little bit less per unit cost on operations because we have more regulations, we have more inspections, we have more investors, we have to do income and rent targeting, so we have a lot more staffing costs. On the nonprofit, it goes up even a little bit higher because we do enhanced property management, we do more services, we do a lot more with residents. The debt portion, you can see a large chunk of the market rate goes to debt. We've already capitalized our reserves, but the market rate takes money out of their operations every year for reserves, and they have the pink section is taxes. We do not pay very much in taxes, so that is a big difference, and you're thinking about the kind of projects we do. And then the yellow is, your rate of return. We have a very tiny, tiny amount to cover our debt coverage ratio. So that's the essential difference between how housing development is financed. We're going to take a break and see if there's any questions on this section. Okay. This is just to show you how we leverage your dollars. We've redeveloped 412 apartments by the Housing Commission. 58 were new, 300 and some were renovated. It's been a total of $66 million, and this sort of shows you the categories of where all those funds came from. About $4 million of that was from local funds, Brownfield, DDA, Ann Arbor Housing Fund, and the Walnut Ridge Sewer Fund. That is very different and more time-consuming, mission-driven to do development like that than if you're a market rate developer or a for-profit affordable developer on how you approach development. This is actually one of our new, this is at Green Baxter, one of our new buildings. The advantages for us of doing new as opposed to acquisition rehab, but we can do both, is you can't really tell from this picture, but we need a lot more accessible units. We need a lot more visible units. We have a lot more people who are disabled. About half of our tenants are disabled with a diagnosed disability. Probably 70–80% are actually have some kind of disability. And that would be the same with Avalon as well. We can increase energy efficiency and save money on our operating costs. I'm going to try to quickly go through these as I can. This is our newest project that we're just about to do demo and new construction, White State and Henry. The tax credits are out for bid right now, so hopefully we'll be moving forward with that in the next couple of months. One thing that the Housing Commission does, one of our missions as a housing commission, not all housing commissions, but ours, is to serve special needs tenants. So over 25% of our units are set aside for homeless households, and we're in the process of applying for some special needs voucher programs with a bunch of community partners. Our biggest challenge really right now is our housing. We are financially stable finally. After all these years, for those of you who've been around for a while, and I keep having to tell you our problems, we're finally going to be financially stable on our housing side. Our biggest issue now is still on our voucher side because we don't get enough administrative fees to cover our staffing. This is just a chart showing you how our budget pans out. We're going to be requesting $68,000 this year from the general fund. Now we're going to talk about we're going to talk about what is being done around the United States to address the same issues we have here with adding more affordable housing. We're going to talk through the ones that we can't use and why we can't, the ones we've tried and haven't worked, and the ones we think will have the biggest impact. I want to turn it over to Teresa.
All right. We're going to be focusing on 4 areas, and it's areas we've talked about before. One is zoning, one is other regulation, the third is funding and financing, the last one is the use of public land. So the first one we have up here, we're going to be talking about some of the tools that are available in other communities but are not available to us locally. One of those is inclusionary zoning. This is on the dream wish list of things we wish we had. What it means is that you would be able to pass a zoning ordinance locally that would require any new residential development to have, say, let's say any development over 4 units, a subdivision, a downtown high-rise, a small 30-unit building. You could say that a certain percentage of any of those units, let's just dream and say it's a quarter of them, since we're dreaming, say 25% of any new residential units would have to be affordable up to 60% AMI. Why this is the dream scenario, why it's great, is that the market is then able to adjust, right? So they can look at their deal of their subdivision, of their high-rise, and they can figure out a pro forma that would allow them to have a certain percentage of affordable units built in and still charge the rents or the sales price that would allow them to do the deal. We don't have to put any money in, it's just flat out required. We don't use this locally because as we look at the state's Rent Control Act, it appears that local units cannot take actions that would limit rents, right? And there's been some talk about, well, are we just being risk averse? There's other communities in other states that have a similar type of rent control ordinances. They're very prevalent throughout the country that have pushed that conversation and tried to take that step. But right now we're not kind of going down that road. We feel that it is a barrier and that we're definitely not enabled to do it. So it's whether or not how much we want to push it. I know Grand Rapids at one point in the last few years was thinking about just going full steam ahead and then got advised by their legal team to hold back. So it's a question of risk tolerance as well. The next one is rent control. So there is the state rent control ordinance that I'll probably talk about far too much tonight. And what it does is basically say that you cannot put a limit on what a private company or owner can charge for rent. One of the things that's been confusing about the rent control ordinance is that it's been interpreted somewhat broadly. So then, the PUD ordinance the city has says that if you're going to do plan unit development, that you have to provide some units at 80% of the area median income or contribute a fee in lieu of affordable housing to the Affordable Housing Fund. Well, is that a form of rent control? So that is one of the questions we're dealing with. And right now, there is a Senate bill, state Senate bill in play called SB 110. I know you guys love the numbers. And what it is, it's been introduced by Senator Schmidt out of the Traverse City area. It's been sponsored by another senator out of Grand Rapids, all areas having problems and concerns around affordable housing, just as we are here. And what it's tries to do is basically clarify that Rent Control Act to say that rent control was never intended to cover all these other tools like zoning. And so it says basically to the effect that voluntary incentives used by local units such as zoning or grants, et cetera, would be allowed. So it clarifies the language. That has gone through the Senate's Local Government Committee, and we're hoping that it'll get onto the floor soon. The Michigan Municipal League has been a partner in sort of lobbying on this behalf, so they give us regular updates. At this point, they had advised us that we should call our senators and ask them to ask that it gets on the Senate floor. So I'll share that with you, and hopefully maybe some of your counterparts in other communities, and we could be requesting that. That clarification would sort of ease everyone's mind and free up some of those local tools. But again, these are some that are on sort of the lower impact scale, right? But we still would love to be able to use them more. Another tool that other communities use is called a linkage or an impact fee. Generally, what it says is that it basically is a study that quantifies on a larger, let's say, commercial office development, the amount of affordable housing that would be needed for workers in that building or to support the new development. And so what it does is sort of quantifies what that cost would be and then charges a flat-out fee for those new commercial office developments. It's not something we feel we can do in the state of Michigan due to the BOLT Act and some other rulings. It's something in play in other states like Colorado and California, for example. But it's a tool, again, on the we wish we had, so we could have more funding coming in for affordable housing. Other dream scenarios that we wish we had. This is from the city of Columbus and Franklin County in Ohio. They have actually been able to use their hotel and motel bed tax, and what they have done is set aside a certain percentage of it to support affordable housing, making that case a similar kind of linkage case that a lot of the workers in the service industry, especially hotels and restaurants, and we know this to be true here, are lower income workers, and they would prefer to be able to have some affordable housing nearby for those workers to be closer to work, but also have access to the services and opportunities in the core city. In this case, it's Columbus, Ohio. They also use a real estate transfer fees. Both of those in Michigan are enabled through state enabling language, and right now we don't feel like there's clarity that we would be able to do so without a state legislative change, although we'd love somebody to look at it a little bit harder for us. Moving on to the regulatory items, we've talked a lot about zoning, right, in various ways, and that there's tools. And a lot of these recommendations are actually in that housing affordability study, and they were clearly recommendations. Again, some of them we can do, some of them we can't do. Plan unit development right now exists at that 80% threshold. Plan projects, affordable housing is one of a series of items that you can select from. You get to choose. So if you want to do a plan project, which basically is allowing you to do some setback changes and some sort of, you're allowed some exemptions from the existing zoning if you choose one of a series of choices, and one of which is affordable housing. So it's not quite the, it doesn't force you into the affordable housing track. The A2D2 zoning you all sort of revisited, I want to say about 1.5 years, 2 years ago, looking at that downtown zoning. At the time, I think you were looking at trying to lower the threshold for residential and have much more of a bonus for affordable housing and or green considerations. And that was sort of left on the shelf while the design guidelines were incorporated. So that is an opportunity that could potentially be revisited. Again, that's a lot of work, right? And a little bit of a small payback on some of these. Accessory dwelling units had some revisions done just about 1 year ago. And limited application. So some of these, again, maybe not the best payback. Not that we want to take them off the table. We think everything should always be on the table, but we want to focus on some with higher impacts. So moving on to funding.
I actually wanted to go back to the previous slide real quick. Changes are made all the time to our ordinances, whether it's zoning, planning, whatever, sewer, water rates, that have a disparate impact on race, have a disparate impact on low-income households. When A2D2 was approved, there was discussion and attempts to provide higher density bonuses for affordable housing. It's still in there. It has not been triggered. Prior to that, if a developer wanted to build a lot of this housing that's been built downtown recently, they would have had to do a PUD, and it would have automatically triggered an affordable component. So back in 2006, 2007, there was, I want to say 4 or 5 projects in the pipeline, had site plan approval. They were about to contribute. One of them was going to include affordable housing. The other ones were doing cash in lieu. There was about $4.5 million committed to going into the housing fund. Then the economy crashed and we adopted A2D2 zoning, and none of those projects ever got triggered to have affordable housing again. And I'm with Teresa. I don't think we should go back to what we had before. There's other reasons why we did the A2D2 zoning. Just hopefully we'll be conscientious of those kinds of changes on impact of low-income housing.
Teresa,
So now,
Jennifer?
yes.
Hi, if I can interrupt.
Yes, please.
I was just putting things together, and on that PUD, I guess I really hadn't realized the depth. I mean, I knew, but I didn't realize how much the PUD would allow flexibility to include affordable housing. And so that was one of my first votes, 5-6 months ago on council, was when I voted against moving the 1140 Broadway development, the rezoning of it from a PUD to a C1AR, a campus business district, which it made it become a by right property now, and 4 stories higher than the master plan and stuff like that. And that's why the community was so opposed to it. But I guess that's sort of a question and a comment, if I understand correctly, of all the things that were lost with that vote of rezoning it from a PUD to a C1AR, that we lost. How many affordable housing units under that, like 80% formula or whatever might it have been?
I'm not familiar with that specific project, but the PUD ordinance has certain thresholds that you can trigger affordable housing, and I think it's 15%, and Derek, is it 20%? So I don't know how many units are at that project. But that is an inherent conflict, and something we have to work through politically is by right zoning is very, as a developer, as well as an affordable housing provider, it is hard to do development when you do not know what the zoning is and what you can do on it. Like, having by right zoning is going to get us farther in the development process, as you can see by all the development that's going on. I happen to think that any housing is good for our community, not just affordable housing, that it impacts the rest of the marketplace. But that is contrary to previous way it was set up, where if you wanted to go high density, high height, you had to include affordable housing. So we lost a tool. That's all. We just lost a tool. It's not the only tool, but we did definitely lose a tool.
Thank you.
Just to follow on, if I make clarification, with moving away from doing more PUDs, now with D1, D2, zoning downtown, don't you have to have 900% FAR to qualify for affordable housing premiums, the way it's designed now? I think that's correct. Yeah, so we're not, so it'd be really big buildings and not getting a lot of this, or as with CORE, the library CORE Spaces project, to supplement, to get more units at 150% of the fair market rent, that required a $1.5 million city contribution to cover the subsidy for 9 units in that building. It didn't cover the construction costs. That was just the subsidy to, address the market rental gap. And Yeah, 9 units. And if you take out, for that project, if you, they factored in Library Lane, but if you took that out, it was over 1,000% FAR. Now, I know the city, staff has said, but Jane, that was 500 whatever percent FAR, but, yeah, I mean, there was a lot of back and forth about, how to calculate that with or without the Library Lane. My point is, it's a massive project, and what was required to do these 9 units was significant, and even at the FAR, they were limited with the affordable housing premium, arrangement, the way it exists now.
We actually would like to steer the conversation to this exact subject. Like, this is the core of the conversation we feel like we need to have is land, public land, that we control and what to do with it, as well as money. You cannot build any affordable housing or acquire and redevelop, unless somebody gives it to you for free, any housing that's geared toward 30% AMI, 50% AMI, even 60% AMI without public subsidy. Whether that public subsidy is federal, whether it's state, whether it's local. We would not have been able to develop all of those houses that we did. We would not have been able to add 58 new apartments on our developments without the local contribution, because we applied for every penny we could out there that we could think of, and we still had a gap. And so the local contribution is really, really important. I don't think you can buy units in the private sector. The city could choose as an option. We're just going to take $10 million and we're going to buy as many units as we can for whatever the cost they are, and they're going to have income limits on them. You could take that same $10 million and you could put it into the housing fund. Organizations like ours in Avalon and Habitat can apply for funding and leverage, $20, $25 for every dollar you put into that fund. And that's why I wanted to show you the difference in the development process when it's a market rate versus a dedicated, mission-driven type of organization, because you can really leverage the heck out of the city's dollars and get more units. And the single most difficult thing it is to do when you're doing affordable housing development, because of the type of funding we have, is to secure property. So if we see a property, whether it's vacant or whether it's a multifamily that we're going to acquire, I can't show up with the realtor and say, here's $4 million. We want to hold this property, but hold on a sec, it's going to take me 2 years to get the other $12 million so we can redevelop this property. So that is, in a market like Ann Arbor, that is the single biggest problem in doing additional new housing development. We've owned, or the city owned, all of our properties. We can redevelop them. We can add density. Avalon's strategy has had to have been acquiring lots of smaller properties with cash as they could pull together a few $100,000 or and occasionally be able to do a larger project. And so the next section we have is really on the money part, and the section after that is on public property. Those are the two best, biggest, most impactful tools the city has in its toolbox right now because of all the other issues of everything else that we've talked about. Currently, we have the mental health millage. Our proposal was that 3/4 of that for the housing portion of it go into the housing fund for projects just like I talked about, for leveraging funds, and 25% to go towards services to provide on those sites, or on our sites specifically. We think we need to adopt a millage for affordable housing prior to the mental health millage expiring in 8 years. Like, that is a significant amount of funding that can really go far and build a big pool. If you had a $5-10 million pool, you could go to a realtor and say, here's my $3 million I'm putting down, or my $4 million I'm putting down to acquire a property, and then work towards pulling together the renovation funds if you need them. Cannot do that right now. So having a large amount of money is super important. We've been exploring doing revenue bond financing, which is a lower interest rate than if you borrow money from a private sector bank. And so it makes your money go farther. We have, in our most recent project, we actually received $600,000 in grant funds from Brownfield grant, what's that called? Brownfield Revolving Loan Fund. And Teresa's going to talk a little bit more about, I'll let her talk about the Brownfield funds and what they're talking about doing over there.
So with 1140 Broadway, one of the things that happened with that was the use of Brownfield TIF for the first time to guarantee some affordable units within a development. So one of the things that we want to do now is go back and kind of create basically a Brownfield policy for its use that would really push the conversation for any use of Brownfield TIF that included residential units, that there would be an affordable housing component. So there's a little devil in the details, and that's going to come back to you at some point, but one of the things that we wanted to do in talking with staff is move forward with something to guarantee that in its use, again, in the city of Ann Arbor, related to residential projects, obviously if you're using the Brownfield TIF for something industrial, it's not appropriate, but when it's relevant, that we want to make sure there's an affordable housing component in each of those projects.
The city of Ann Arbor has the best pilot in the entire country. The only one I'm aware of that's $1 a unit per year. I don't know anyone else that does that. That has a huge impact on our operating costs and our ability to have lower rents. So thank you for that. And some of the other local leveraging are the money managed by community development, block grant home, local DDA funds. So definitely any way we can increase money into the pot will help do many more units. That's just basic math. What we really would like to ask City Council to talk about tonight in particular is directing staff to conduct an analysis of all the publicly owned property, not just the Y lot, but any publicly owned property that might be underutilized. Maybe it has a single-story building, maybe it's vacant, maybe it's a surface lot. It may be that some don't make sense to include any affordable or just a portion and do mixed income. Like, we can do mixed income housing, and we set aside whatever percent we think is feasible for low income to make the project work. That is not a problem. It may be some sites, because they're too complicated, because they need to have additional parking structure or commercial, wouldn't necessarily be something that we could handle. But that is what we'd like to do, is have that directive to be able to do that analysis, and not just city-owned property. We would like to look at county-owned property, and in the future, hopefully other public entities that are in the city, and look at them as well.
Not to be named. One other thing with the analysis that we were thinking about is making sure that we refer to the existing city plans, planning documents for any parcels that might be already committed within a different project. And it's something that we're looking to do, if we receive your direction, to try and complete by the end of this year. So something that we can complete in December, so if there's any action that would follow, it would come back in January.
And one of the things I think needs discussion, I'll throw out my thoughts on it, but we're hoping you'll have discussion tonight, is should there be income targeted units in the downtown? I would say that I wouldn't throw that option out. As I mentioned earlier, the markets constantly change, so do our funders. So right now, our biggest source of funding through tax credits, they emphasize you're more likely to be funded if you're in downtown, you're in a core city, you're in an employment center, you're near transportation, you're near jobs. Huge amount of points. It is more expensive on a per square foot, but if you get the funding, then you've figured out how to make the financing work. If you have it in a location that you can't get the funding, you get nothing. And so we applied 5 times for tax credits for Swift Lane, and we finally were funded, but we were not scoring very high in the areas that they are emphasizing. And that could change next year. Right now, there's a 4-year increase in tax credits available, 12.5% increase based on the last federal budget. So now is the time to really hit hard on those kinds of projects. And really, it's a matter of, if you can make it financially feasible by leveraging funds, then it doesn't really matter if the per unit cost is higher, if you can make the project happen. And I would also argue that if we don't include any income restricted housing in the downtown, any affordable housing, we are just going to become more racially inequitable. We're going to become more segregated. And so the argument that it's cheaper to build not in the downtown is an argument for putting all the low-income people in one area. And so we really have to figure out strategies to do all across the city. especially in the second ward, because I don't think we have very many in there.
Or it could be
Oh.
an argument for getting.
All right, final slide. Now we're turning it over to you. So not only do we want to do this analysis and figure out where these affordable units can be built on public property, we think that the best developer to do that are local nonprofits that are mission-driven. You can trust us. We've done this housing. We are going to tell you the truth of what our costs are. We're going to tell you we can only do X at X to AMI, and this because we don't have to make a profit. We're going to do as many as we can. That's what we want. And those nonprofits are the Ann Arbor Housing Commission, Avalon Housing, and Habitat for Humanity. Those are really the only three nonprofits that have done significant amount of quantity of affordable housing. And so we think that if the city is willing to either donate those properties, or if you want to maintain control, that's totally understandable and doable, because you could do a ground lease for $1 a unit per year, and that counts as a donation when you're applying for funds. And so removing that cost and removing that search in the marketplace for land is going to be a huge impact on being able to do a large number of affordable housing units. We talked about the millage that we think should be adopted, and then for properties that we can't figure out a feasible way to do them among our nonprofits, then the city should either sell them or ground lease them for market rate development and have half the proceeds go into that housing fund so that those proceeds can be used on the properties that we are going to be able to develop. That is our recommendation for tonight as our biggest impact decisions that could be made. And we're done, I think. Yes.
At some point, you had cooperatives on one of your slides, but you didn't raise that as an option.
So I don't believe that the funding mechanism for the way the co-ops were built with HUD mortgage financing, I don't believe that's available for new co-ops, but we can happily explore that as one of the options. You can do it as like a market rate co-op, but the way our co-ops are funded back in the day, they don't have that particular funding source.
Councilmember Kalasapathy.
Yeah, that's a good question, because I have many friends at Arrowwood, which is in Ward 1, and they keep raising the same issue. Can we have like a phase 2, especially with the aging population,
Right.
like not having 2 stories, but single stories? So is there no other funding option other than HUD for co-op based? Because I think Arrowwood is just like such a shining model
Yeah, it
for
is.
housing. I
No,
mean,
it
it's
is.
fabulous, isn't it? And also a second question I had was, I know about a year ago we passed the ordinance for ADUs, accessory dwelling units, and I think the last update we got from staff is not a single unit was built under that. And do you have a feel for what's going on, or why it's not working, or?
I believe there's been at least one application. There's 2 holdups, as far as I would say, is that the most interest that we received by far was for people wanting to do it on a detached unit, like say above a garage. And currently, the city ordinance requires a separate tap fee and sewer line to connect to that. I know that one thing that Environmental Services was saying, that potentially you wouldn't have to pay the cost of the connection fee because it's already been paid, which is great, but you still have to do a separate sewer line rather than being able to build off the one in the main house. My last conversation with Mr. Hoopy was that he was willing to look into that possible change, which would lower some costs, but that's something that has to be done yet. It would require an ordinance change to not require the separate sewer line. But if you think about where different garages are located in different subdivisions and developments in your house, sometimes they're close to the street, but often they're quite far back, and so it would be a significant distance to do so. So that's an additional fee. In some cases, that might cost as much as doing the rehab of the garage, for example. So there's definitely a cost concern. The second thing that I think is, I think we're still waiting on some of the deed restriction language related to there having to be the owner has to live in one or either unit. So I think that hasn't done, but that's just a simple thing that could be cleaned up.
And I think for the co-ops, we will definitely explore financing mechanisms. If we can get revenue bonds, there's a HUD program called the 221D4, which is lower than market rate, lower the interest rate than market rate. Depending on their rent revenue, they may be able to borrow money to renovate. Doing the new construction co-op model, it would need a lot of cash, but we can figure out a model. Like if you had X amount of cash, you could do 50 units or 30 units. You know, that's why I say each site is site-specific as to what you can do.
Councilor Lum.
Thank you. On the recommendations slide, you touched on, thanks. It essentially says low-income housing is feasible on city-owned property. The city, should donate the land to a nonprofit housing developer with the history of developing housing in the city. And you mentioned in terms of those that have experience here, you mentioned Habitat, Avalon, and the Housing Commission. I'm wondering what makes the kinds of projects that these organizations have done here so unique that experience in doing them in Ann Arbor is critical in your mind versus opening, the door to others, making it more competitive, if you will.
Well, I can think of a couple things. One, our mission is the Ann Arbor area as well as Avalon. Habitat has gone outside of Ann Arbor, but that's because they haven't been able to make it feasible to work in Ann Arbor. And so we're already a Ann Arbor committed nonprofit. It doesn't mean another nonprofit couldn't do it. But I think as far as having that trust as a community in who your developer is, because many, many conversations happen up here as well as in audience with neighbors about those GD developers. You can't trust them. They're taking all this money. It's like, don't go with for-profit market rate developers then, because we don't know, what their financials look like. You do have to go to the nonprofit. And the other thing is, it is hard to develop in Ann Arbor. For-profit, nonprofit, understanding the building process, working with local architects, working with local engineering firms, those are all super critical to make your project not be a disaster. And I'm not ruling out at all another outside nonprofit. I just think if you want to move forward quicker with more confidence, I would go with what you have available.
Okay. One of the things you said in your comments, comparing construction development costs for for-profit people versus not-for-profit people and organizations, you said they weren't that different. And you mentioned that developers get money from the bank when you were talking about, how they finance these projects. I will just say, just talking to some local developers, my takeaway is that bank financing isn't that easy to get. And the student high-rises that have been built, those were basically financed by, Wall Street kinds of investors. And then these properties tend to flip pretty quickly and multiple times because they get their development fees out of the project and they're gone. But it is, I would just note that it is difficult, for-profit people to, privately finance, projects as well. You did, if I could, you were talking about the analysis of the best use of the property. It was slide 39. And you mentioned, the types of uses for mixed or to serve the income area categories, mixed income, low income, mixed use, senior, or essentially none of the above, like selling and contributing the funds to the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. Can you speak a bit more to how one analyzes the, quote unquote, best use of a property? I mean, what criteria, are used? What do we look at? What characteristics? You mentioned parking as an example, but I'm wondering what characteristics of a property make it better for one use vis-a-vis another?
So first you look at zoning. So you look at the zoning, see what you can do by right. Now, obviously with affordable housing, you could do a PUD if you wanted to, if you thought the current zoning wasn't going to work there. But if you start with the current zoning, you work with a design team that can mock up, like a back of the envelope, like how many units could you build here under this density, what's required? And you look at all the costs. So is parking required, how much? And so when you first figure out your development costs, like really you'd max out the site on what can be there. But you'd also look at, are there other plans in the works at the city for those sites? So you'd want to talk to the DDA and find out, was there parking planned at those sites that you want to incorporate? Is it a site that was targeted for the green belt in some capacity? And so we'd want to talk to other community partners and entities to find out what kinds of things might have been in discussion on planning. Once you figure out the total development costs, then you can figure out, you try to figure out what your rent or sales targets are. I'm gonna do rent, so we would figure out our rent targets. And so I would probably have a start with everything being market rate. Okay, if everything was market rate, here's how much rent revenue. Now, then I would start reducing. Like if I had this target and this target, how many low-income units could I get there? And then alternatively, you could start with, I want all low income, see what my rent is, and see if it's financially infeasible and start increasing some of the rent so you have a mixture. And so it's really about mostly zoning, what can be built there, and what your income targets are, and then you figure out what revenue sources. So for the Y lot, we could look at that lot and have different scenarios and say, okay, what if we did 100 SROs? How much would that cost? Where would the money come from? How much of that would have to be city money? Because there aren't really places that you can get money from. There's no HUD or tax credit funding for SROs. You'd probably have to use some kind of city funding or straight funding. So if you wanted 100 SROs, it would cost the city, whatever, $6 million plus land. If you want to do a mixed income with half or whatever, 60% at 60% median, then we could figure out the funding sources and what portion would be a city contribution based on what we know. Or if we did it all market rate, how much would the value be so that it could be sold and half those funds go into the trust fund. So it's really, that's why every site is different. Every site's different.
Okay, thanks. I'd just say, thanks for all the good data, all the helpful insights on this challenge, and, because we're going to be making decisions about the Y lot and other city-owned properties, so give us a lot of good material here to educate us and guide us. Thanks.
Yep. And I hear Avalon poking me in the back saying, don't forget to mention, one reason to go with local nonprofits is we already have built-in relationships with service providers. We reinvest back in the community. All of our offices are here. And so it's a different kind of nonprofit than, going down to wherever, Indiana or California.
Yeah.
It's like having for-profit developers from California versus local. It's like kind of the same idea.
Yeah, I mean, I have nothing but good things to say about Avalon, and but I know that, some of the projects that have been attempted, in recent years, like the one on North Main, that was a tough site, eventually didn't go anywhere. But what I heard, when you're talking also about the construction cost per square foot, that those were significant. They were like in the $400 or so range. And, versus a, say, for-profit person, where it's in this 200 to 300, generally speaking, kind of range. And yeah, it was a tough project, and lots of challenges. And so that's just, that's also, one of those things that you have to consider when you're trying to figure out how to finance,
Right.
building these units.
Two other things I haven't mentioned. One is, based on typical funding sources that we use, we have stricter environmental review requirements. There's some places we can't build because they're next to a railroad, the noise is too high, but a market rate developer could. So that would have to be site-specific as well to rule out certain funding. And if we use HUD funding or local funds, we have to pay prevailing wage. So that would be the one thing that would cause our construction costs to be higher than a for-profit.
They have to as well.
If they have, if they use local funds. If they, I don't know how you guys do it.
Well, you're right. You're right. I stand corrected.
Not the
Yes.
city wage, but
Right.
prevailing wage, Davis-Bacon wages. Because construction costs, or contractors are so high right now in Ann Arbor, that doesn't increase it by 50%, it might increase it by 10%. Just because wages are already so high. Those would be one of the really only areas where the cost would be higher.
I'm sorry, Councilman Wong. You mentioned that at some point you referenced inclusionary zoning, but then I forget where it came from, but that it was seen as a low impact result. Did I mishear that, or is that perceived to be the case?
It would be a high impact result.
Okay, I must have misheard that.
It's legal to do in the state of Michigan,
right.
Or we're being advised that we can't do it.
And it's generally thought that, am I correct too, am I generally thought that the SB 110 paves the way for that, or at least removes a major obstacle to it?
I would say it's like the first step and maybe a series of steps. So what it would do is clarify that we could use things like that plan unit development for sure, and we'd be able to enforce it, that DDA grants would have an enforcement mechanism if they're requiring affordable housing, et cetera, which is great. And I think it's the first step towards it, but I think ideally we would want separate enabling legislation from the state to clearly say you do have the power locally, cities, villages, et cetera, to use inclusionary zoning as a tool. So I like to think of it as the first step, we change the state legislature, and then we get the second one.
Sure.
Piece of cake, right?
Done. Why didn't you say so in the first place?
I mean, I should have. I'm sorry.
That's quite all right. Well, for my part, and as to the main ask, that strikes me as a great next step. It seems to me that the city does have land, where we have land and it is underutilized, that is our primary resource, and that a high and great use of it would be for housing, and where we can develop it, where we can whether using trusted local partners or otherwise for the benefit of folks who aren't presently able to live here, that would be outstanding. So that strikes me as a great idea. Councilor Eaton.
Thank you. Really, funding is the fundamental question throughout all of this. And we've set a goal of trying to develop 140 units per year, which is a pretty big goal, really. And understanding that it's site-specific and every project differs, over the course of the 20 years that we need to develop 140 units per year, what's a round figure, average amount that we need to spend per year?
I think if we did a range of $25,000 to $50,000 a unit as local, and everything else is leveraged, whether it's a bank or whether it's grant money from somewhere else, I think that's a good, safe number. We've been coming in at less than $25,000 a unit, but when we start all competing with each other, we probably should at least be conservative and say 50,000.
Are you going to make me do the math? Or
yes.
3.5 million.
Thank you. So about 3.5 million a year, according to the mayor. It's kind of take your breath away money. So the money that we're diverting from the mental health millage is about $900,000 a year. So we're really going to fall short even in the 8 years that that's available.
Right. That's why we think, and even though we have other local sources, we have the DDA, we have community development, home funds, brownfield, I think we need a dedicated source, like an actual housing millage for affordable housing. Separate source as a known entity.
Also, during the time of the millage, we are hoping that the core deal goes through and that there is that potential influx of half of the sales price that could go into affordable housing that would help in the short term. But obviously, once that money is gone, the millage is gone, then what's the plan?
Thank you very much.
Councilmember Warpahowski.
Thank you, Mayor Taylor. Yes, first of all, I just want to say that I see the allocation that the city's made from the unrestricted rebate from the millage as an allocation and not as a diversion. It's fully within the permitted spend for that rebate. I want to underscore just a couple points you made and then follow up with a couple of questions. First of all, you mentioned that it's hard to, I forget exactly how you said it, but it's difficult to develop in Ann Arbor. Reading the performance metrics in the budget, it's 130 days from site plan submission to planning commission approval, and then from planning commission to the city council, it's another 170 days. So yes, we do put up a significant fight when it comes to development. The other thing you mentioned, any housing is good housing. Over the last 10 years, the city's added 12,000 new jobs, 6,000 new students, and between 2000 and 2015, 5,000 people 65 and older. So presumably many of those are retirees. So between people who are out of the workforce and still living here, new jobs, new students, I think those are all good things, but it creates a significant housing crunch that for all the beds that have been increased, I don't think we've met that goal. I guess on your ask, one of my questions was, do you see, if we cast the net broadly for any potential publicly owned land within the city under city control, there's actually probably a lot of big and small parcels. Is your proposal that it would be, round one would be to look at the easy parcels, either high value in terms of the potential number of units or easier to process, and then maybe down the road we'd look at some of the trickier ones, or would you want to take a look at everything in the first go around?
I would look at everything at the first go around because some of the smaller parcels might be habitat appropriate. They do their thing with their parcels. The other ones might be something that would be appropriate for Avalon or the Housing Commission, and then something else might not be feasible, or we might say push that down the road because it's too complicated. But yeah, some way, I want to look at everything, but I think we should quantify what can move forward fastly as part of that analysis.
Okay. And as you're talking about some of the sites might be mixed income, are mixed income sites eligible for tax credit financing?
Yes, you can do it two ways. You can do it in one structure where the tax credits just pay to subsidize the 80% AMI or less, whatever your income target is, and then you have to do regular financing for the rest of your units. Or you can condo your building, which I don't recommend, but you might need to, and you can have market rate in one part, and then you can have tax credit in another part, so it depends on how you want to structure it.
Okay. And then in terms of your recommendation to go with the 3 local developers, as I'm recalling from the proposals that came in for the Platte Road development, some of the proposals that had higher numbers of affordable units weren't from the 3 nonprofit developers you mentioned. How do you help us make sense of what we were seeing from the competitive bidding process, of you might be able to get more from elsewhere? How does that help me make sense of that?
I don't think I can.
I will take a shot
You
at
wanna take a
it.
shot
So
at it?
every year we get calls from affordable housing developers. As Jennifer was explaining, the area median income is very high, and so it's very appealing to affordable housing developers because you can also have higher rents. Our fair market rents are higher than in other communities. And so it's attractive in what you would get as a return. So it's a certain time of year, we start to get calls before the next cycle of low-income housing tax credits come through. And so several of them have tried to get tax credits. I think the most recent one was 2 rounds ago, Scioto Township. It was a decent site, but it was kind of far from, it didn't score well in the walk score, wasn't an urban or a core community. And so it's someone who's less experienced in working with MSHA and their scoring. And I want to say, I won't get the right number of years, but for sure in the last 5 years, there hasn't been anyone else locally besides IPSI, Ann Arbor Housing Commission, Avalon, that have actually acquired tax credits in the state of Michigan for anything in Washtenaw County. There had been stuff previously, but that experience and those relationships are important. There could be, obviously, another developer who could do it, but we do know that they are proven and committed locally.
I think that's the last question is, the focus has been on units for 30, 50, and 60% AMI. I think that's absolutely appropriate for tonight's conversation. But I'm curious, what are your thoughts? People who are making 61% AMI, 80% AMI, 100% AMI are struggling to afford housing in the city as well. Recognizing that I don't believe we should be using public subsidy for those units. That aside, what are your thoughts for addressing housing affordability for those middle-income residents?
I don't think we can without increasing housing, period, because it's very market-driven, and even with all of the units that have been built in the last 5 or 6 or 7 years, you're not really seeing the full impact of what happens when you have increased housing, because as you mentioned, we have more people coming in that are working here. We have more students that are being admitted at U of M. So while units are increasing, you have demand increasing. If you increased enough units, eventually it really is going to be impacting the marketplace. And it may not be that you're living in downtown Ann Arbor in a new high-rise, but you might be living on Fifth Avenue in an older home that's been split up into housing, that's in the downtown. But if we don't increase the number of units, if we don't increase density, we're not ever going to be able to reach any of those markets other than the highest end.
Thank you.
Councilmember Westfall.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor, and thank you for the great presentation. Can't get all the questions answered tonight, and I look forward to how this plays out in future studies and recommendations. Just to piggyback on what you finished talking about, I think, and you mentioned it in presentation, about all housing helps. We often hear from folks about, the need for housing, but what we're seeing is high-value, high-rise buildings with pretty high rents and generally targeted towards students. Can you, I'm sure it could fill several books of rationale, but in a nutshell, can you help us understand, in your view, how the construction of new housing, even like that, which is not typically who we want to provide for necessarily, how that helps the broader community and rent levels, for example?
I'll answer that in a backwards way. U of M needs to provide more housing for their students, period. Like, that is part of our plan, is we need to put pressure on U of M to provide that housing, because that's the single biggest impact on the marketplace is students. And they keep adding more students, and that's what the market is responding to. And if it was people moving from one place into these high-rises, they'd be making way for someone else. But if you're adding more students and they're filling what's there, you're not making way for other people to have housing. So that is a huge problem. We need to get U of M to build more housing for their staff and students. They have a lot of land, too. They need to do it.
There was another, if you talk to the city financial people, they might, they might be interested in having that on private land as well, but, I guess it's another conversation we'll have with the university. It was interesting that the motto of one of the original housing movements was house people, not cars, and I saw a couple references to parking regulation changes and how that might help the construction of units. Can you flesh that out a little bit? And I guess in your answer, if you can, if that plays at all into perhaps the reason why we don't see people taking advantage of the 900% density, the FAR, for affordable housing downtown, because you have to, at this point, still have to park your premiums. Does that, in your opinion, play out downtown as well as outside of downtown, the parking requirements, and spatially, cost-wise, inhibit the number of units being built?
I would suspect you would be better able to answer that with your background. I can tell you our experience with our development. We have talked about one strategy as regulatory. If you look at some of the requirements, it adds cost. It's incremental. It's not a huge impact, but it does add cost. So parking is one of them. We got a number of our parking spaces waived for our redevelopment of White State and Henry, and I don't think we're going to have a problem. Some of our family sites, they do need more parking. We have Class A bicycle containers required on all of our properties. No one's ever going to use a Class A bicycle container. It costs $12,000. That's not going to make the difference on make or break my project, but a lot of these things that we require for aesthetic reasons or more green building or, those kinds of things, they are adding cost to everybody's projects. I would be in support of the city looking at that. That's like a huge, gigantic, long process to look at some of those requirements. So probably looking at the most expensive ones first, and I'm guessing it would be parking. It would be like higher impact, especially in the downtown, for sure.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. I'm glad that my fellow council members get to see how wonderful Jennifer Hall is, because I get to have the privilege of working with her in the Housing Commission. So back when we had dots for priorities, this slide 39, looking at an analysis of our use of public land, was always one of my dots. So I'm thrilled to see it here. I'm trying to understand, because it seems like a pretty short timeline, how you see that being operationalized. So who would actually conduct the analysis? Would it be city, county, because it does, we've been asking for a long time, and it seems to just get pushed on the road, so due to lots of other priorities. So I'm wondering how you would see that going.
This is my thoughts. It doesn't mean that's what's going to happen. I think that myself, Derek, Brett, Planning Department, Howard, Tom, Finance, start with that. Teresa from the county, Susan from the DDA, because a lot of these parcels are in the DDA district. Start with that, see how far our own staff can get us on the zoning and density and like that back of the envelope. I'm pretty sure it will require us to have some consultation from architects, engineers who build in Ann Arbor to give us real numbers, or we can go with our best guesstimates if we don't want to spend an intense amount of time and do like, these are the ranges of where costs come in. So we could do it more that way, or we could do a very intensive analysis. I think we probably should do an intensive one of the Y lot because it is on the table right now. But maybe for the other ones, it's more of a back of the envelope. And then I would work on the financial modeling part, probably with Avalon, because we have to do this all the time. But I think the reason we have it as a long term is because I feel like we would want to get some community input that wouldn't just be all internal, and have some time for some community meetings to talk about it as well.
Okay, thank you.
Since you mentioned the Y-Lot, you had a slide, it was 24, another one of your interesting slides. It showed the shift in financing from largely debt on market rate projects to largely equity on subsidized housing projects. And so we haven't yet, undertaken or started to study affordable housing options for the Y-Lot yet, but and it's probably a question for Mr. Crawford. So when you go off and start analyzing the best use for these parcels, I think it would be helpful, because one takeaway from that slide is that it would seem that the opportunity for debt funding would be limited there too, based on, again, what this slide is showing us. So that would be another piece of analysis for that particular property, I would say. Then if I just may, since you're here and we're, in the midst of leading up to approving the budget, you indicated one of your slides that and someone asked about this, that the Housing Commission operating budget for 2019, the general fund support request is $68,000 plus IT, HR, and payroll support. I'm assuming that IT, HR, and payroll support is one of the budget questions asked a week or so ago. They referenced $364,000. Is that what that is?
Sounds about right. Yeah.
Okay. And if you can, I know you don't have a crystal ball, but can you comment on what you see at this point for general fund support going forward for the next, couple of years?
So the 68,000 is, I forget the terminology, where it's one time as opposed to like baked into the budget.
Non-recurring.
Non-recurring, thank you. So the 68,000 was non-recurring. We have 160,000 is recurring. And so when I look in the next 4 to 5 years, I think we can make our financing work barring a really big change at HUD on our funding on the voucher program. I cannot predict what our current president or our current secretary of HUD, what changes that they are proposing for that budget. The rest of our budget, the housing side, the units we own, the units we manage, do not need any city support, operating support. Like those are operating, self-finance. We've got them to a point where they don't need ongoing operating subsidy.
Thank you. For my second thought, it was about U of M. I know you mentioned large properties for their housing. I myself had transfer orientation today, and I see students struggle with housing all the time, but you spoke of some of our smaller not-for-profit partners as well, and U of M not only owns big pieces of land where I see a lot of potential for building housing with maybe some private-public partnerships, but also they have all these, someone passes away and they leave little pieces of land in the estate. So while not the first go-around where we're looking at city-owned properties, I think that is something to consider going forward, and maybe a really valuable legacy that someone could leave behind as well.
Further discussion? Thank you very much. That was super helpful.
All right, thank you.
We now come to public comment general time. Public comment general time is an opportunity for members of the public to speak to council and the community about municipal interest. To speak at public comment general time, one need not have signed up in advance. Speakers will have 3 minutes in which to speak, so please pay close attention to the time clock. As a matter of courtesy, we may have only one person speaking at a time. Finally, if you require assistance in speaking before council, we'd be delighted to provide it to you. Is there anyone who'd like to speak at public comment?
I'm Glenn Nelson. Thank you for this opportunity. I applaud the attention to supportive services in the mental health area, that 25% set aside. I would have liked to hear in the big picture more about the supportive services part, because I think that's absolutely critical to providing good housing to some of our most struggling people. Then the second thing I wanted to mention is that I hope all of you have seen the article in yesterday's paper, A Cry for Help, subtitle, Michigan lags far behind in much needed mental health support for at-risk K through 12 students. And I urge you to consider this as you think about whether to fund $75,000 from the mental health millage for mental health services planning. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who'd like to speak at public comment?
Good evening. I'm Julie Stein. Thanks for this opportunity. I just wanted to say thank you very much for having this working session. It's very important, and what a fabulous team we have of people who can explain the ins and outs of one of the most complicated things there is in our lives in this city. I can't say enough, because I have said it many times to many of you. This is the most tragic part of our system in Ann Arbor. And I really deeply appreciate the position when they started by talking about this as an issue of inequality. And that is the thing that makes this so, so critical. I'm currently working in LA with the homelessness system there. And when I see what that city has been able to do by passing a half-cent sales tax and several millages, so that there are literally millions and millions and millions of dollars coming into LA to create new permanent supportive housing, new shelters, to address their concern, their problem, which is unbelievable. I know we can do it. And I agree with their position about a millage. We've talked about a millage for affordable housing in this town, I think for 15 years. Jane, what do you think? Probably longer. Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah, I mean, it's been a really long time. So I really highly recommend that. And then my favorite pet peeve, since they brought it up about the university, why couldn't the university provide some percentage, tiny, maybe $1, of every football ticket that is sold to go to the Affordable Housing Fund in Ann Arbor? Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who'd like to speak at public comment?
Good evening, Amanda Carlisle. I just think one thing that wasn't shared tonight from Jennifer and Teresa was around why local nonprofits are so important to this. And one thing I just wanted to mention is we have a lot of low-income housing tax credit projects that are now coming out of their affordability periods. We're seeing just in the next couple of years about 350 units coming out of affordability, and it's likely that they will not re-syndicate for tax credits. They will then go market rate. And so we're going to end up seeing sort of like a loss in our affordable housing units as a result of not having committed mission-based nonprofits doing this work and developing affordable housing units. So I just wanted to share that with you all because I think they forgot to mention it.
Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Sam Copy. I live at 818 Henry. I have a couple comments about the discussion tonight. Thank you for all the wonderful information. I would have liked if people, I just realized that the whole presentation was on a certain site. If someone could have been nice enough to tell people where to find it, and then for people who do not have online devices, which there's people like that in Ann Arbor, despite the cost of housing, it would be nice to have a simple handout. So despite the fact that we speak in jargon all the time about these issues, if there was a simple handout, one sheet that would have been very cheap to provide, then everyone could take part in this conversation and understand what all you people are saying. So thank you. Have a good evening.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who'd like to speak at public comment? Seeing no one, public comment is closed. We have a motion to adjourn, please. Moved by Councilmember Smith, second by Councilmember Crapo. Discussion. All in favor? Opposed? We are adjourned.